Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathashala. I am Professor K. Srinivas from Pondicherry University. I teach philosophy at that university. I am the course coordinator for Indian religion and philosophy in the subject Indian culture. In this module, we are going to learn about Advaita, and the following objectives are important for us in this particular module. What is Advaita? What is the nature of supreme reality? Is world real or unreal? How do we attain liberation? The term Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. In other words, it deals with the end portions of the Veda called the Upanishads. Advaita Vedanta is one of the Vedantic schools. A systematic account of this school of thought was first presented by Shankara in 8th century AD in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya. However, he should not be mistaken for the founder of the school, as he is one of the propagators of this school or this particular system of philosophy. Prior to Shankara, there were many Advaitins like Gaudapada, Govinda, and others who propagated this tradition. Therefore, Shankara is not the founder of this school. The other notable figures who contributed a lot to the development of Advaita Vedanta are Gaudapada, Govinda, Madhusudana Saraswati, Vachaspati Mishra, Prakashatman. The important sources of this school of thought are the Upanishads. The Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras are also the sources of this particular school of thought. All these three put together are called Prasthanatraya. The main objective of this school is to maintain the Upanishadic view that Brahman is the supreme reality and is one and undifferentiated. To start with Advaita epistemology, Advaita accepted 6 Pramāņas, or sources of knowledge. And of course, they are perception, pratyaksha, inference, anumana, testimony, shabda, comparison, upamāna, postulation, arthāpatti, and non-cognition, anupalabdhi. One does not find much difference between Advaita position and Nyaya position concerning the treatment of perception, inference, and testimony. However, the rest of the 3 Pramāņas are discussed by Advaita in a totally different manner. For instance, let us start with comparison. It is regarded as an independent and valid source of knowledge. It is a non-perceptual source in that it is not equated with perception. It cannot also be reduced to other forms of non-perceptual means, such as inference. Knowledge obtained through comparison is expressed in the form of the judgment. A is like B. where the object B is being perceived, while the object A is perceived sometime in the past and is remembered and compared with B. To illustrate this point, let us examine the following example. For instance, a person who saw a cow some time ago in a barn and later comes across a wild cow in a zoo and claims the cow I saw in the barn is like the wild cow I now perceive in the zoo. According to Advaita, this claim cannot be one of perception, since one of the objects involved in the judgment is not perceived right now. Also, the claim is not regarded as memory-based, for what we perceived in the past and is now remembered is the cow in the barn, and it's a similarity to the wild cow now being perceived in the forest. So that is the comparison we are going to make. Therefore, comparison cannot be reduced to perception. Comparison cannot be reduced to memory experience. Comparison cannot be reduced to inference. This is the reason Advaitins hold that comparison as an independent pramāna by itself. Coming to postulation or arthāpatti, this is also an independent, valid source of knowledge. A person employs postulation in order to account for an observed fact which cannot otherwise be explained. For instance, when a person says that he is fasting day and night, but he is nevertheless observed to be gaining weight. Suppose we observe him to be fasting during the day, then we account for the fact that he is gaining weight since he eats during the night. Thus we postulate about his eating during the night to obtain the given fact. Now, what is to be noticed here is that postulation is neither perception nor inference like comparison. It is not perception because we have not perceived him eating during night, nor can it be treated as inference, for there is no invariable connection, vyapti, between growing fact and eating in the night. Postulation is mostly like hypothesis in Western logic, but one can also notice difference between the two. Hypothesis is a tentative and may be rejected subsequently, but postulation is the only way to explain a given observable fact. This is the fundamental difference between hypothesis and postulation. Therefore, the Advaitins consider postulation as an independent pramāna because it cannot be subsumed under perception or inference. Now coming to non-cognition, anupalabdhi. This is also recognized as an independent and valid source of knowledge by Advaitins. It's a kind of a cognition in which we notice the absence of an entity. For example, when someone says that there is no television in this room, results in the knowledge of absence of an object, but it cannot be treated as the absence of knowledge. Therefore, such a form of cognition provides us with the knowledge of absence of a thing. This form of cognition is concerned with negative facts or with the non-existence of objects and the states of affairs. For example, the non-existence of a camel in my study is known through the absence of my cognition of a camel in the study. Such non-cognition is known as anupalabdhi. This source of knowledge, according to Advaita, cannot be reduced to any 5 sources of knowledge. It is not correct to think that non-existence of an object is inferred from its non-cognition, for inference requires universal proposition asserting an invariable relation vyapti between 2 terms. There is no such proposition employed in my perception of the absence of a camel in my study. Therefore, non-cognition cannot be the case of perception, comparison, testimony, or postulation. It is also important to keep in mind that in all these cases of non-cognition, they are not the cases of non-existence. We do not perceive a chair in a dark room. That does not mean that there is no chair in that room. The non-cognition of an object leads to its non-existence only under the circumstances in which it should have been perceived. But in this particular case, the knowledge of absence clearly states a particular object does not exist. Therefore, it becomes a negative fact of our knowledge scheme. So therefore, the anupalabdhi or non-cognition has its own role to play in the epistemology according to Advaita. Now, the metaphysics of non-dualism. This is a very important component in Advaita Vedanta. Shankara has provided us with one of the most lucid expositions of Advaita Vedanta in his writing, especially in his magnum opus, Brahma Sutra Bhashya. In his metaphysics, Shankara examines the levels of being. For him, Brahman is pure existence Sat, pure consciousness Chit, and pure bliss Ananda. And this supreme reality is one, infinite, and indivisible. One of the most interesting features of Shankara's metaphysics is the concept of sublation or contradictoriness. For instance, sublation is basically a mental process of correcting and rectifying errors of one's judgment concerning the objects of reality. One can sublate or contradict one's previous judgment in the light of a new experience that contradicts it. In other words, a person may either regard the judgment as false or disvalue it in some significant sense. The sublation of a given judgment necessarily leads to a new judgment. A sublation is not merely intended to sublate judgments alone, but can be extended to concepts, objects, relations, and in general, any content of consciousness. Shankara holds that sublatability is the criterion of the ontological status of any content of consciousness. Anything that is sublatable belongs to lesser degree of reality and value that which replaces it as a result of sublation. It is through this method of sublation Shankara arrives at his highest metaphysical point, the Brahman. Now coming to the levels of reality, Shankara, based on the criterion of sublatability, distinguishes reality, appearance, and unreality. Reality is that which in principle cannot be sublated by any other form of experience. Appearance, on the contrary, can be sublated by other experiences. Unreality is that which in principle can or cannot be sublated. It must be noted that the act of sublation presupposes the dualism between knower and the known, the subject and the object, consciousness and the contents of consciousness. Sublatability also presupposes plurality of objects, concepts, judgments and contents of consciousness. It is necessary to have a distinction between subject and object in sublation, for it is the subject that sublates the object. Plurality of objects is also necessary for sublation in order to juxtapose one object or experience against another incompatible object or experience. For judging the first object or experience has less degree of reality or value than the second. Based on these remarks, to say that the experience of reality is unsublatable is to say that no other experience can conceivably contradict the experience of reality. That is the reason why the Shankara says the day-to-day cognitions of the objects can be sublated in the sense that one cognition is sublated by another cognition. But this is not the case with supreme reality, because our experience of supreme reality cannot be sublated by any other experience. Therefore, sublation is possible only with regard to the objects of empirical reality, but sublation or contradiction is not possible in the case of the supreme reality, Brahman. So that is the point which he is trying to make through this argument. The reason for this is that reality is devoid of all distinctions and contradictions. It is not only the distinction between one object and another, but also between the subject and the object, the self and the non-self. Appearance phenomenon, in terminology of Plato and Kant, is that in principle can be sublated. In contrast to Brahman as pure being, appearance may be construed in the realm of existence. Shankara classifies existence into three levels: absolute reality or paramarthika satta, empirical existence, vyavaharika satta, and dream reality, the pratibhasika satta. In all these realities, objects exist. Perhaps in pratibhasika satta or in dream reality, you find dream objects. But these dream objects can be sublated through waking experience. Similarly, in vyavaharika satta, you have empirical objects which can be sublated by successive cognitions. But in paramarthika satta, there is only one reality called Brahman, and this reality can never be sublated. That is the reason Brahman alone is really real. That is the reason why it is called supreme reality. All other forms of reality are mere shadows. They are not permanent, for they are sublated time and again. Empirical existence and the objects of dream can be sublated by other forms of experience. For instance, the cognition of dream objects can be sublated by the cognition of waking experience. The objects of dream and their cognitions are true insofar as the dream persists. Similarly, the objects of empirical existence and their cognitions can also be sublated by a higher order experience, which is bereft of subject-object distinction. Anything that cannot become object of our experience, actual or possible, is unreal. The reason why an unreal object cannot be experienced is that the concept of an unreal object is self-contradictory. For example, a round square is unreal, barren woman's child is unreal, sky lotus is also unreal, for such objects do not have any existence in this empirical world. For anything to be sublated, it must be, in principle, an object of our experience. Since unreal objects do not exist, they cannot be objects of our experience. Therefore, the notion of sublatability cannot be extended to unreal objects. Coming to the theory of causation, Advaita advocates a peculiar theory of causation called Anirvichaniyavada. However, in order to understand Advaita theory of causation, there is a need to understand the theory of causation advocated by the other schools, especially Satkaryavada. According to this doctrine, the material effect is identified with material cause. In other words, the effect pre-exists in the cause. Advaitins do not differ with Sankhya up to this point. However, there are two versions of Satkaryavada. They are Parinamavada and Vivartavada. The Parinamavada of Sankhya is criticized by Shankara. The change in form is considered to be a real change by Parinamavadins. Shankara questions this view. Although the changes in form are perceived, these changes are not considered to be real, as the form does not have any reality of its own, apart from its material cause. If a change in form is regarded as a real change, then a person can have many realities. He or she keeps on changing his postures frequently. Our day-to-day experience tells us that a person is one and the same throughout. Another important feature that underscores this view is that if substances are different from their forms, then how can we relate qualities or forms to the substances? Either we must admit formless substances or a third reality that can connect forms with substances. But to connect the reality with the other two, we may require another reality. Thus, it leads to infinite regness, anavastha. Now, if the view that form does not have any independent existence apart from its substance is admitted, then such change in the mere form is not real. Such a view paves the way for Shankara's ingenious doctrine of apparent change, Vivartavada. For example, when one perceives a rope as a snake, it is not that rope has reality and rope is transformed into snake. Remaining as rope, it only appears as a snake. Likewise, we may perceive any other illusory objects which appear to be real, but their existence is only phenomenal. So, there is a fundamental difference between Sankhya theory of causation and Advaita theory of causation. Sankhya advocates Satkaryavada, according to which the effect pre-exists in the cause. But on the contrary, Shankara advocates Vivartavada, in which he says it is not that there is a kind of change, parinama, in the effect. There is something called transfiguration. Form alone changes, but there is no change in the content. That is what is strictly called Vivartavada. It is not the transformation, there is no change in the content, but there is only change in the form. Whereas Satkaryavadins advocate the view, there is the change in the content. The content of the cause and the content of the effect, they are one and the same. If they are one and the same, what kind of cause and effect relation can be established in this case? Therefore, Advaitins criticized this point of view and held that it is not the change in content, it is only the change in the form, which is technically known as Vivartavada. The form alone changes, but the content remains as it is. Now coming to the nature of Supreme Reality. The Supreme Reality, Brahmanatman, alone is real. The essential nature, Swarupa Lakshana of Brahmanatman, is pure being Sat, the pure consciousness Chit, and pure bliss Ananda. It is free from all contradictions and is infinite and indescribable. It is indescribable, for it is bereft of all qualities nirguna. The terms such as existence, consciousness, and bliss are only used in defining sense, but not in the qualifying sense, to distinguish Brahmanatman, the Supreme Reality, from everything else. In other words, Sat, Chit, Ananda are not the qualities of Brahman. They are the very constitutive aspects of Brahman. That is the reason Shankara calls Brahman per se as nirguna or qualityless. When the Upanishads describe Brahmanatman as indescribable and unknowable, what they mean is that Brahmanatman cannot be described positively, but only negatively as what it is not. This method is technically known as Neti Neti method in the Upanishads. This does not mean that indeterminate Brahmanatman is empty. Shankara observes that though it may appear to be empty for a dull-witted Manda Buddhi, it is not. Brahmanatman, which is the ground of everything, cannot be empty or void. The moment we say the Brahmanatman is empty or void, we are trying to compare this position of Advaita with that of Nagarjuna Sunyavada. But Advaitins do not accept Nagarjuna Sunyavada because according to Nagarjuna, the ultimate reality is sunyata or voidness. But the ultimate reality for Advaitins is not void. It is with full, it is something full. When it is something full, its existence is always positive. Therefore, there is a fundamental distinction between the ultimate reality of Nagarjuna, Sunyavadins, and the ultimate reality of the Advaitins, the Brahmanatman. Interpretations are totally different. Coming to liberation. According to Advaita Vedanta, liberation is possible while one is alive, Jivan Mukti. The legitimate path for liberation is the path of knowledge, Jnana Marga. One has to realize that one's Atman is none other than Brahman. But it also prescribes some strict ethical discipline for every spiritual aspirant. In order to gain control over one's body and mind, one has to practice the eightfold path of yoga of Patanjali. Apart from that, there are 4 important disciplines to be followed. They are: one has to discriminate between the eternal and non-eternal. One has to detach oneself from all forms of selfish pursuits, both worldly and otherworldly. And one has to cultivate all these 6 values like tranquility, restraint, renunciation, endurance, meditation, and faith. And finally, one has to develop the desire for liberation. Shankara did not oppose the practice of the way of action, Karma Marga, and the way of devotion, Bhakti Marga. Since the nature of Brahman is consciousness, therefore, the realization of Brahman is also through consciousness, knowledge. The way of action can only purify our mind and makes us non-egoistic. Similarly, the way of devotion also purifies our mind. If I surrender everything to God, then my ego also removed through this surrender. But the path of devotion still distinguishes the devotee from God. The ego of devotee still persists. So long as the ego persists, the liberation is not possible. Once a spiritual aspirant attains the steady of mind, he or she has to practice Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana to realize one's own self, Aham Brahmasmi. So now, to conclude, what is Advaita? We have learned that fundamentally there is no distinction between Brahman and Atman. That is what we call Advaita. There is no dual reality. There is no dualism. Both are one and the same. There is no difference between Brahman and Atman. What is the nature of supreme reality? The Brahman, Atman, as I said, it is nirguna. That means it is qualityless. Since it is qualityless, it cannot be described. It is transrational. It is also translogical, translinguistic, and it is a niravavaya. It doesn't have any parts. So these are the qualities, it is the nature of the supreme reality. Now coming to the world. Is world real or unreal? According to Advaita, the world is the creation of Maya. Maya in association with Brahman becomes Ishvara, the creator God, and this creator God is also known as Saguna Brahman, and this Saguna Brahman creates the world of objects. These objects of the world are neither real nor unreal. If they are real, then their perception should not involve in any kind of sublation or contradiction. But it is not the case. our perceptions of these objects involve sublation or contradiction. That's the reason the world of objects is not real. But at the same time, it is also not unreal, because if it is unreal, it cannot be experienced. The world of objects we experience. Therefore, the world of objects is unreal. In that sense, the Advaitins call the world is neither real nor unreal. That is what sadasat vilakshana. Then finally coming to how do we attain liberation? Out of 3 margas prescribed, Jnana Marga, Bhakti Marga and Karma Marga. It is only through Jnana Marga we attain liberation, because Brahman is of nature of consciousness. Then how do you realize this consciousness? Only through Jnana. That is the reason why Jnana Marga is prescribed for liberation. And this liberation is possible through what you call sadhana, some kind of rigorous ethical practice. And this liberation can be achieved while one is alive. This is technically called Jivan Mukti. Friends, if you want to know more about Advaita, go to the suggested readings and carefully read the text provided. Then we have more information about Advaita Vedanta. Thank you very much.